Good morning. My name is Chandra Chilmakuri. I'm with CH2M. My background is in hydrodynamics, and I've been part of the BDCP and BDCP EAS surface water modeling team. So the first topic that I'll try to cover here is provide a general overview of the hydrodynamics modeling that was performed for BDCP. So the primary goals of the modeling, what we are terming as physical modeling here is there are several elements that are part of BDCP that need to be represented in the numerical models to assess the effects on the various covered species. There are several physical proposals and changes to the operations of the current CVP, SWP systems. And also, I think the key word in that first bullet there is the perform a comparative analysis using a baseline versus or looking at the changes under an alternative and compare it to the baseline. And the other key goal is to evaluate the BDCP alternatives and the no action alternative, which is the baseline, at different time frames, considering the project is being planned or for a long to perform over a long period of time. We assumed over a 50-year period of time, and the alternatives and the baseline, both of them were evaluated at approximately year 2025, which is when the intakes are expected to be turned on in the North Delta, and at the what we are calling as the late long term, which is at around 50 years after the intakes are turned on. That's about year 2060. So in order to do that, we had to use an integrated set of models which allow us to evaluate the changes in the hydrology to changes in the operations all the way into the delta hydrodynamics and the salinity transport, and also further the effects on the surface, the temperature in the rivers and the reservoirs, which are critical for the evaluation of the impacts on the fish. The models that were used were carefully integrated, where the information was cascading all the way from the primary systems operations model, which provides the surface water flows and storage in the reservoirs. It's called CALSIM 2. And it's been developed by the Department of Water Resources and U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, and has been in use for several years right now. And it covers the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project system, and it provides basically the primary model, which provides the flows and the storage and the diversions and for all the alternatives that were evaluated. So the models that were selected had to be refined to include several of the physical and operational changes that we expect to see over the 50-year periods. Some of them are part of the plan, and some of them are actually we expect that are likely to occur over the 50-year periods, such as the climate change and the sea level rise. So, as part of the analysis, we have integrated the effects of climate change and sea level rise into the evaluation of the alternatives and the baselines. So I just listed some of the key physical and operational changes that we expect to see as part of the plan or immaterial of the plan too. The climate change, for instance, we have considered a range of projections based on the IPCC's 2005 projections, and we have selected a range of scenarios which represents there's a wide range of projections out there, and almost all of the projections are indicating warming, but as far as the precipitation is concerned, some of them are indicating it could get wetter, or some are indicating it would be drier. So we had to kind of bracket the uncertainty there is in those projections. So we have selected a range of scenarios which would bracket the range of uncertainty in the climate projections. Most of the analysis was performed on what we think was is a median projection based on all the projections that are available to us. And the sea level rise, again, we have used information that's been published by Ramstorff, again, we use the median projections for that, and we assumed a 15 centimeter sea level rise at 2025 and 45 centimeter sea level rise at 2060 at Golden Gate. The other physical changes that we expect are because of that are part of the plan. The major one is a large-scale restoration in the delta, and the expectation is that it would be 25,000 acres at year 2025 and 65,000 acres at 2060. So that's a huge change to the delta head morphology, and we have to capture that as accurately as possible to understand the effects on the fish in the delta. The other modification is the North Delta intakes on the Sacramento River near the Freeport, of course. And also there are, in addition to that, there are several operational changes that are being proposed to the CVP and SWP system. We had to incorporate those changes. And another one is the conservation measure 2, which includes the Fremont Weir changes to the Fremont Weir and other changes to the Yolo bypass to increase the flooding and duration and frequency of the flooding in the Yolo bypass. So with such a large scale plan and so many changes, we had a unique challenge as to evaluating several alternatives, numerous alternatives, and also since we want to plan or minimize the uncertainty with the proposal as much as possible, so we had to evaluate these proposed alternatives on a large range of hydrologic conditions. And at the same time, the changes are of such huge magnitude that we want to use the best possible tools that can evaluate the processes that would be occurring, that we would expect to occur under these changes. So we had, as a compromise between trying to evaluate, over a large range of hydrologic conditions, and at the same time trying to resolve some higher dimensional processes, we had to use a scaling approach for the modeling. And the way we have done that is we had used the two-dimensional and three-dimensional hydrodynamics models, specifically RMA2 and the UNTRIM three-dimensional model to simulate the sea level rise. UNTRIM three-dimensional model was used to simulate the sea level rise effects at the 2025 and 2060, which the assumptions that is 15 centimeter and 45 centimeter sea level rise. And we used that outcomes of that model to inform the two-dimensional RMA2 model to understand, to make sure that the RMA2 model is simulating the salinity transport, the hydrodynamics and the salinity transport as similar to the UNTRIM model, and just to get a little bit more confidence in the two-dimensional model. We then use that information to train a one-dimensional DSM2 model, which has been developed by the Department of Water Resources and has been used for several planning projects. And the good thing about DSM2 is it can faithfully replicate the hydrodynamics in the delta. And also, it's not as computationally intensive as the other 2D and 3D models that we used. So it would allow us to run large, or evaluate these alternatives on a large range of hydrologic conditions. So we used the results from the 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional models to what we are terming as corroborate, but it's essentially kind of train to replicate the effects of the large-scale restoration and the sea level rise using the 1D model. So that once we trained the 1-dimensional DSM2 model, we used that to train an artificial neural network, which essentially mimics what the flow salinity response that is predicted by the DSM2. And this artificial neural network actually is part of the overall system operations model, CALSIM2, and it rapidly transforms or provides an answer as to, depending on amount of flow that CALSIM2 predicts, what would be the salinity in the delta. And that's the critical piece of information that CALSIM2 relies on, considering we have there are water quality standards in the delta that need to be complied with, and so CALSIM2 relies upon this artificial neural network to understand whether the amount of flow that's coming into the delta would be sufficient to meet or comply with those standards. And finally, so that the results from the CALSIM2 are the basis for all the evaluations, all the effects analysis that was done. And we have run the DSM2 model one more time using the revised or the modified flows and diversions that come out of the CALSIM2 to see what kind of hydrodynamic changes that we see in the delta. And those are the results that were used for a majority of the effects analysis in the delta. Any questions so far? Go ahead.
So did you have a suite of scenarios for locations or restoration?
Oh.
Sorry. So did you have a number of alternatives in terms of distribution of locations for the restoration from CM4?
Right. So we have, for the majority of the modeling, we have assumed one hypothetical footprint for the restoration, but we have eventually conducted a sensitivity analysis as to how would the results vary with different hypothetical footprints. Right now, there is no decision as to where the actual restoration would be, except for the general understanding of what those areas would be. So we have done some sensitivity analysis, but for majority of the modeling, for the proposal has assumed one hypothetical footprint.
So that span between Susan to Kashlu, right in that sensitivity analysis?
Correct. Yes, it has been.
Just a point of clarification. So you start out with the 2D model, and you're training the 1D model. So in the 1D model, your open water habitats are modeled as a CSTR, essentially.
Right.
So what did you do then? Did you tweak the connection of that CSTR to make sure that your salinity was in line with what your 2D and your 3D models were showing you? Is that
right? So
okay.
Yeah, I will explain it in a second. But yes, that's pretty much what we did. We have defined the dispersion coefficients in the 1D model to make sure that we were replicating the incremental change in the salinities.
Okay, and so then the 1D model had these tuning for the CSTRs, and then that was what was used to train the artificial neural net that then goes into CALSIM.
Correct.
Okay.
Oops, wrong one. So that's a good segue. This slide is basically describing or diving into how the DSM2 model was corroborated to match the higher dimensional models. So to start off, in 2009, we have recalibrated the one-dimensional DSM2 model of which represents the entire delta from Sacramento to Vernalis to Martinez. That's the geographic scope of that model. It has been calibrated to better reflect the geometric conditions at that time, which prior to that recalibration effort, the model did not include the Liberty Island, for instance, and we seem to have we have noticed that change has affected the hydrodynamics in the Rio Vista junction or the cash flow junction, and we thought that it's a critical piece of information that needs to be part of the baseline model. So we recalibrated the model in 2009 to better reflect the existing conditions, and we then used like I described earlier, the higher dimensional models to represent the sea level rise effects and the restoration effects and we used the results from those models to tune the DSM2 model. And the calibration, we called the corroboration success when we saw the incremental changes in the tidal flows, the net flows, the water levels, and the salinity are consistent between the DSM2 and the higher dimensional models. And all the three topics that I listed there are described in detail in the BDCP ARES Appendix 5A, Section D. It's several set of attachments to Section D there where we have these efforts described in detail. Just an example of how the restoration areas were modeled. So the plot on the left there is it's a contour map of the water levels, expected water levels at the early long term based on the two-dimensional RMA2 modeling, and the plot here on the right here is represents how those changes were incorporated into the one-dimensional DSM2 modeling. And most of the areas are represented as open water areas connected to the channels or with wide channels connected to the existing channels, and with a small weir at the entrance to calibrate the breach, to basically represent the breaches that are proposed are simulated in the 2D model. And in the 1D model, either the reservoir inflow and outflow are tuned to match the breach flows, or the weir coefficients that we had at the channels entrances were modified to match the breach flows that we got from the 2D model. So basically, we tried to represent the amount of area that we were seeing was inundated as part of the 2D model in the 1D model to start with. So we made sure that the amount of tidal inundation area is about the same in between the models. That's an absolute necessity to make sure that our tidal flows and the hydrodynamics end up matching with the higher dimensional model. So just an example of what we looked at as part of the corroboration. A lot of information. I'll try to walk you through there. So we have two different curves here. The red curve represents the two-dimensional model result, and the green curve represents the DSM2 model result. And what you're seeing there is the Caslu, the flow, and this is the tidal flow, net flow in Caslu at Ryer Island, which is basically the entrance, if you will, that's the kind of the entrance point to the entire Caslu complex. The results are presented at the early long term. So this represents the footprint that was assumed for 25,000 acre restoration. The tidal flows so what you see up here is just a comparison of what the tidal flows between the RMA2 and DSM2. Here we are showing the comparison between the net flows at that location over the 2-year period that this corroboration was performed. But our corroboration was based on, or the metrics that we have used to figure out whether or not the corroboration was success was based on these two plots down here, which are basically the incremental changes between the RMA2's existing configuration model to RMA2's early long-term model. And the same thing with the DSM2. We chose to use this as the incremental change as a metric because the baselines could differ in several instances, even though they are calibrated to match the observed conditions. Both of them do individually a good job at doing, but there are still some differences. So we wanted to minimize take out that bias between the two models of that individual model, and therefore we focused our corroboration on the incremental change between that we've seen in the higher dimensional model. So this is an example. So we made sure that we are matching well in both in tidal flows as well as the net flows.
So this is net flows where?
And this is at Caslew, in Caslew at Rhode Island, for instance. So this is an example for how the salinity was corroborated. Again, the focus has been on the early long-term, incremental change. What we have seen, this is an example at the Emerton, Sacramento River at Emerton location, for instance, and the top plot shows the incremental change, the absolute incremental change between the between the RMA's existing model to RMA's early long-term model. Same, the red line represents the DSM2's incremental change that we expect at the early long-term. And we tried to match the DSM2 to replicate the RMA's incremental change. The bottom plot is just showing the same information as a % of the mean or the baseline salinity. So in the Appendix 5A of the EIR-EIS, we did include several of these plots to provide provides the range of uncertainty associated with this modeling, just to provide the reader an understanding of how these models perform, how the DSM2 is doing at this early long-term and late long-term conditions. So finally, kind of described this earlier, but we are putting all these changes together in the CALSIM2, and CALSIM2 is the primary model that's providing the flows and diversions that are being used to evaluate the effects on the fisheries on cover species. So we, like I described earlier, we used the DSM2, the modified DSM2, to train the new ANNs to feed into CALSIM2. And we have used a HECRAS model to revise the rating curve for the Fremont Weir to reflect the proposed notch at the Fremont Weir. We incorporated the revised rating curve in the CALSIM2 modeling. We also incorporated CALSIM2 is a monthly model, and we actually incorporated some daily the model such that we take into account the daily flow variability in determining how much north delta diversion how much water could be diverted at the proposed north delta intakes. And finally, the CALSIM2 model has been modified to make sure that all the proposed operations criteria were included in it. If you have any questions there, I will jump into the north delta. Sorry, wrong one again. I will try to describe the bypass flow criteria for the north delta diversion. Okay. All right, that sounds good.
Do you want to take any questions?
Sure, yes, if you have any questions so far. Okay.
Okay, we'll take a break, resume back at 10:15, and we'll pick up where you are in your presentation.